There is a scene almost no one outside of Ethiopia has ever heard narrated aloud. A woman, nearly 1,000 years old by the old reckoning, sits at the mouth of a cave carved into a mountainside. Her husband has just been buried inside it. She has 6 days left to live, and in those 6 days, according to a text called The Conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan, she does something no one else in the story ever does. She tells her children, plainly and without shame, everything she remembers about the world before the exile. This is that story, drawn from a body of scripture that has shaped Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity for well over 1,000 years, a tradition that never left this material out, even while other church traditions quietly set it aside. It's a strange thing, when you think about it, that the woman at the center of the most famous story in the Western world is usually reduced to a single scene and a single mistake. This text refuses to do that. It gives her a death, a memory, a prophecy, and a legacy, and it's worth sitting with, in full, before asking why almost nobody has heard it. The text places Adam's death on a Friday. Ethiopian tradition holds that Friday was also the day of his creation, so his life closes on the same day it began, a detail the ancient compilers clearly meant as intentional symmetry, tying the end of his story back to the very beginning of it. By this point in the narrative, Adam and Eve are described as having lived for centuries after their expulsion. The text follows an older tradition, echoed in Genesis itself, in which the earliest human lifespans stretch across many hundreds of years. Adam has watched generations of his own children and grandchildren live and die. He has known farming, grief, the murder of one son by another, and the slow, hard work of building something resembling a life outside a garden that no longer exists for him. By the time he dies, he is, in every sense the text intends, an old world unto himself, the last living link to a place none of his descendants have ever seen. Eve does not die with him. According to the text, she lives 6 more days, and those 6 days are deliberately mirrored against the 6 days of creation. Where the earlier chapters of Genesis describe 6 days of building, light, sky, water, land, creatures, and finally humanity, Eve's final 6 days are framed as a kind of unbuilding, the slow release of a life that had carried the memory of paradise longer than any other living thing on earth. For those 6 days, she is, in a very literal sense, the last witness. Every other person alive was born after the expulsion. Only she and Adam had ever stood inside the garden, and now Adam is gone. She sits at the entrance of the cave the text calls the Cave of Treasures, refusing food, refusing rest, her attention fixed somewhere her children cannot follow. It's worth pausing on what the cave itself represents in this tradition. The Cave of Treasures is not simply a burial site. In the text that bears its name, it is described as the place where Adam kept the gold, frankincense, and myrrh that God gave him on the way out of Eden. Gifts, the tradition says, that were meant to be given again one day, centuries later, by visitors from the east to a child in Bethlehem. Whether or not a reader takes that connection literally, it tells you something about how this text sees Eve and Adam, not as footnotes to a mistake, but as the first custodians of a promise that the rest of the story is still walking toward. Every object inside that cave, in other words, is described as waiting for something, for someone, across a span of time the two of them will never live to see. Her children gather. They speak to her. The text is almost tender in how it describes their confusion. They can see she is present in body, but something in her has already turned toward a horizon they cannot see. And this is where the narrative does something unusual for ancient literature about the first woman. It doesn't rush past her. It slows all the way down and lets her speak. What she describes to her children isn't a systematic theology. It's memory, fragmented, sensory, insistent, the way real memory of a lost place tends to be. It doesn't come out in order. It comes out the way grief usually does, circling back to the same handful of images again and again, as if repeating them is the only way to keep them from slipping further away. She talks about light that didn't behave like the light they knew. Not sunlight pouring from a single point in the sky, but something that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the ground itself and the leaves themselves held their own glow, so that there was no shadow anywhere, because there was no single source to cast one. She tells her children that the closest thing she can compare it to, in the world they know, is standing in a clearing at the exact moment before dawn breaks, except that in the garden, that particular light never changed and never faded. She talks about the rivers. The text names 4 rivers flowing out of Eden, the Pishon, the Gin, the Tigris, and the Euphrates, and tradition around this passage often lingers on the Pishon in particular, describing gold in its bed unlike ordinary gold, and water so clear that every grain on the riverbed was visible even in the deepest, fastest-moving current. She describes wading into that water as a young woman, before any of this had happened, and being able to see her own reflection not just on the surface but somehow inside it, as though the river itself were made of glass rather than water. She talks about the animals, how they moved without fear, how they came to her and Adam willingly, how the serpent before its corruption had been the most beautiful of all the creatures in the garden, nothing like the image her grandchildren would grow up associating with it. She tells them she used to sit for hours simply watching the way the animals moved together, without hierarchy, without predation, in a stillness that she says she has never once witnessed again in all her centuries outside the garden's walls. And then she talks about the tree at the center of it all, not primarily its fruit, but its presence. She says the fragrance of the tree of life was not a smell in the way they would understand a smell. It was something that entered your lungs and changed how your entire body felt, filling you with a calm so complete that the very concept of fear had no foothold while you stood near it. And she tells them that after hundreds of years in exile, after centuries of sleeping on stone floors and eating whatever the cursed ground would yield, that scent is still embedded in her memory, as sharp and as real to her as the day she was banished. She tells Seth, directly, not to look at the thorns on the ground around them and assume that this is how the world was always meant to work. The thorns were not the design. They were the punishment. The original earth, she insists, was something else entirely, something his generation had never seen and, she fears, could not even properly imagine, because they have nothing in their own experience to measure it against. She is terrified, the text makes clear, that if she dies without passing this memory on fully, her grandchildren will grow comfortable inside a broken world. They will mistake the thorns for the garden. They will accept exile as home. And that, more than her own death, is what she cannot allow to happen unchallenged. This is where the text quietly does something remarkable with her character. While Adam, in this telling, busies himself with work and law and the practical machinery of survival, Eve is cast as the one who kept the blueprint of paradise alive, who carried it, the text suggests, like a flame in a world that was steadily going dark around her. She spends her last hours making absolutely certain that flame passes to her children before it burns out with her. The Ethiopian tradition honors her for exactly this. It does not primarily remember her as the woman who made a mistake. It remembers her as the first teacher of what was lost, the one person who still remembered the way back. Before the vision arrives, the text lingers on something quieter. Eve simply sitting, watching, waiting. For nearly a full week, she is the only living person on the planet who remembers what it felt like to walk through the garden. She is, in the language the tradition uses for this passage, something like a widow not just of her husband but of the entire world she once knew. Every person alive at that point in history owes their existence to her, and yet not one of them can share the actual weight of what she carries, because none of them were ever there to begin with. The text describes her refusing to eat or drink during this stretch. Her body, it says, is failing steadily, but her mind grows sharper than it has been in decades, as though everything unnecessary is being stripped away so that only the essential memories remain. Her eyes stay fixed on the horizon, searching, the text suggests, for some trace of the light she lost, some faint glow from Eden still visible somewhere beyond the hills, even though she surely knows, on some level, that no such glow could ever be seen from this distance. She is not simply mourning in this stretch of the narrative. She is functioning, the text implies, as something like a bridge between two worlds, the physical world behind her, full of the children and grandchildren gathered around the cave, and the unseen world ahead of her, where Adam has just gone. She is the only one present who can, even faintly, perceive both sides of that divide. Her family can see her. They cannot see what she is seeing, or hear what she is beginning to hear. And that gap between her private experience and their inability to share it is exactly what makes the vision that follows land with such force when it finally breaks through. On the fourth day after Adam's burial, she stops speaking mid-sentence. Her eyes stay open, but she is no longer looking at anyone around her. Seth calls her name. Her other children try gently shaking her. Nothing reaches her. The text describes her as entering a state beyond both sleep and ordinary waking, her body still present in the cave, her awareness gone somewhere else entirely. And then it happens. The sky above the cave is described as tearing open directly overhead, not a gradual parting, but something violent and sudden, like fabric pulled apart by a force too strong to resist. She does not see darkness on the other side of that opening, and she does not see an empty grave waiting to receive her. She sees a chariot of overwhelming light descending from above, drawn by four enormous winged beings whose wings are so vast and so luminous that they block out the sky for a great distance in every direction. The light coming off those wings, the text is careful to note, is not fire and not ordinary sunlight. It is the same light she remembered from the garden, that warm, living glow that seemed to breathe and pulse with intention rather than simply illuminate. And riding within that chariot, surrounded by ranks of celestial beings arranged in precise formation, she sees the soul of her husband. He is being escorted upward by the archangels Michael and Gabriel, and she understands, watching this unfold, that she is witnessing the very first human soul in history to make this particular crossing. No living person before her had ever seen anything like it. What she sees next, the text says, breaks the centuries of guilt she had carried since the expulsion. She witnesses Adam's soul being led to a place of pure, clear water, where the angels wash him until the garment of light stripped from him at the moment of exile is fully restored. His brightness returns. His original glory comes back to him. He is, in the language the text uses, made clean again, not punished further, not condemned, but returned to something closer to what he had been before everything went wrong. That vision undoes something in her that had been fixed in place for centuries. The shame, the guilt, the belief that she had ruined everything permanently and beyond repair. She watches Adam being forgiven, and she understands, in that moment, that death was never simply a punishment handed down and left to stand forever. It was a return. The exile, however long and however painful, was never meant to be permanent. And that understanding reshapes the entire tone of her final hours. She stops behaving like a condemned woman quietly counting down whatever time remains to her, and begins behaving instead like someone preparing, with real purpose, to go home. By the dawn of the fifth day, the text describes a heavy stillness settling over the land, the kind of quiet that tends to arrive just before something significant is about to shift. Eve understands, in this telling, that her remaining time is no longer measured comfortably in days. It is measured now in hours. In those final hours, she calls for a gathering, every living descendant, every branch of the family she and Adam had produced across their long lives. They come from mountain ridges and valley shadows, walking considerable distances across rough terrain for one last chance to see the first mother of the human family. The text describes thousands gathering, essentially the entire human population alive at that point in the story, standing before her in a silence so complete it seems to draw the air out of the sky itself. She has no gold to hand out, no land to formally divide among them. The earth around them is still wild and largely unclaimed. What she gives them instead is a prophecy, one that later Jewish and Christian tradition, developing along entirely separate lines centuries afterward, would go on to echo in strikingly similar terms. She tells them a day is coming when the entire surface of the earth will be washed clean by water, a flood meant to scour away the corruption already beginning to take root among the earliest generations. Her vision does not stop there. She tells them another reckoning will follow, much further down the timeline than any of them could easily imagine. Not water this time. Fire. The world, she says, will one day be tested by flame, a genuinely unsettling thing to hear for a people who have only recently learned to control fire at all, who know it mainly as a tool for warmth and cooking rather than as an instrument of judgment. But she pairs that warning with a promise sturdy enough to anchor their fear. She tells them that the human line carried in her own body will survive both catastrophes, the drowning and the burning alike. No flood will erase it. No fire will consume it entirely. And she speaks of one specific descendant, born from her own flesh far down the family line, who will accomplish something no other human being in the story has ever managed. He will walk back through the sealed gates of the garden, and he will bring all of humanity with him when he does. Read on its own terms, this stands as one of the earliest surviving literary instances of a promised deliverer being spoken directly to a grieving, frightened people, and notably, in this account, the promise doesn't come from a king seated on a throne, or a priest standing in a temple. It comes from a dying woman at the edge of a cave, offering a lifeline of hope to a family weeping at the feet of the very origin point of their own existence. She is describing, in this telling, events that will not unfold for thousands of years, all while standing at the threshold of her own death, her lungs still pulling in the thin, cool air of the ancient world around her. The most striking part of the passage, and the part most often left out of popular retellings of Genesis, is that she delivers this entire prophecy with the bearing of someone who is not guessing or speculating. She speaks, the text implies, as someone reporting exactly what she has just been shown. The shift from the fifth day to the sixth marks the point where the physical world, in this telling, begins visibly responding. When Eve finally stops breathing, the ground beneath her does not simply go still. It begins, the text says, to vibrate, not the violent shaking of an earthquake, but a slow, rhythmic pulse, closer to a heartbeat than to a tremor. The scrolls describe this as the earth expressing a kind of recognition, welcoming back the flesh and bone that had originally been shaped from its own dust at the very start of the story. Her sons handle her body with a reverence the text frames as establishing the very first funeral rites in human history. They wrap her in fine white cloth that catches what little light reaches into the cave. They apply fragrant spices drawn from the sacred stores kept there, offerings meant to honor the dignity of the woman the tradition calls the first queen. Every gesture is described as deliberate, every motion carrying the weight of a ritual being performed for the first time and destined, the text suggests, to be repeated by every generation that follows.